Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Nemesis, the true story of Aristotle Onassis, Jackie O, and the love triangle that brought down the Kennedys, by Peter Evans. Narrated by Michael Butler Murray. Introduction. When he hated, nobody was spared. Christina Onassis. I first met Aristotle Onassis on January 5th, 1968, at his apartment on Avenue Foch, Paris. Thinking of making a book about his life, he had written to his friend Jean-Paul Getty, asking him to recommend a writer. Probably because I had recently spent some time interviewing him for a magazine profile, Getty had simply returned the letter with my name and telephone number written in the margin. It was good enough for Onassis. Was I interested? Onassis was probably the most famous millionaire in the world. His affair with Maria Callas had made him sexy, as well as notorious. Of course I was interested, but not if he just wanted a hagiographer. I asked what kind of book he had in mind. He started to tell me the story of his life, his childhood in Smyrna, now Izmir, how he had survived the massacre of 1922, and became the head of his family when his father was thrown into prison by the Turks, their escape to Athens, and his flight to Argentina, where he made his first fortune. Although I knew that I was seeing a performance, the alchemy of money, sex, and mystery that was at the core of his story was irresistible. Over lunch at Maxime's, I took the bait. I quickly discovered that he did not respond well to question-and-answer interview techniques. He was at his best when he was free associating, preferably over a meal, in a bar, or simply walking the streets late at night in London, Paris, or New York. Like all spellbinders, he liked to have an audience. In Paris, Johnny Meyer, an old Hollywood publicity man who described himself as Onassis's aide-de-camp, sometimes tagged along with an elegant companion from Madame Claude's call-girl establishment, or a showgirl from the Crazy Horse. Occasionally, Onassis's son, Alexander, joined us, but he seemed ill at ease listening to Onassis's stories. Theirs was not a happy relationship, although Alexander, a kind and decent young man, was always respectful to his father. The man who inspired Onassis best was Constantine Gratsos, his oldest and closest friend, and the architect of many of his biggest schemes. "I will sometimes lie to you," Onassis once told me, "but Costa will always tell you the truth." Although he had great charm and could be extraordinarily generous, he was also capable of sadism toward those closest to him, and his mood could switch at alarming speed. Exhilaration could turn to despair, and not only when he drank. When I mentioned Stavros Niarchos' name, before I knew enough to tread warily around anything to do with his rival, brother-in-law, and the man who was soon to marry his ex-wife and the mother of his children, Tina Livanos, he left the room, slamming the door so hard that I expected never to see him again. Nevertheless, he continued to come and go through the spring and summer months of 1968. I would receive a call to meet him in Paris, where we would sometimes talk for many hours, often through the night. Sometimes, though, he granted me only a few minutes, and once he failed to find time to talk to me at all, after what had seemed to be a most urgent summons. I worked with him in this fashion for 10 months, before he canceled the deal. A week later, on October 20th, 1968, he married Jacqueline Kennedy. In the spring of 1974, Onassis told me that he wanted to resume work on the book. His marriage to Jackie had been a sham. On paper, it had lasted 6 years. In reality, it was over within weeks of the nuptials on his private island of Scorpios, marked from beginning to end by calamity. Alexander had been killed. Tina had died. His daughter Christina had been married and divorced, and her life was a mess. He had lost Monaco, the principality over which he ruled for more than a decade, and his dream of making a new fortune in partnership with the colonel's dictatorship in Greece had collapsed. An even more ambitious plan to take over Haiti had ended badly. He was suffering from myasthenia gravis, a disorder of the body's autoimmune system, which made it difficult for him to talk. We both knew that he was dying, and when I asked him why he had become interested in the book again, he told me, "I hate leaving anything unfinished." But he was a curious as well as a vain man, and I knew that what I would write about him when he was dead mattered to him. Throughout the next 6 or 7 months until his death in March 1975, we continued to work on the book we both knew he would not live to see published. Meanwhile, his instinct for self-preservation had degenerated with age and illness into paranoia. Obsessed by tricks and games to test the loyalty of his family and friends, he never lost the power to unnerve. And our book was his last attempt to fix how the world would remember him. He clearly believed he had achieved his purpose the last time we said goodbye. "What you don't know now," he told me with the slow, polite drawl that had deceived lawyers, financiers, and lovers for years. "Nobody will ever know." 6 weeks later, Aristotle Socrates Onassis was dead. Shortly after it was published in 1986, I took a copy of Ari, The Life and Times of Aristotle Socrates Onassis, to Yannis Georgakis in Athens. A distinguished Greek lawyer, former chairman of Olympic Airways, and Onassis's house intellectual and raisonneur, Georgakis had joined the Athens University Law School at 15 and graduated at 20. He continued to pursue his studies at the universities of Munich, Heidelberg, and Leipzig, where he obtained his doctorate in criminal law in 1938. He taught there until he returned to Greece at the outbreak of World War II. Georgakis had been my most reliable informant and a wise sounding board after Onassis's death. A discreet homosexual with a gentle manner and disarming sense of humor, he was not, however, someone to be trifled with. During the German occupation, he defended bravely, and without remuneration, hundreds of Greek resistance fighters before German courts-martial. He regarded Onassis with affection, yet he could be tough on him too. Onassis, he had warned me the first time we met, was a charming psychopath, bound by absolutely no moral imperatives at all. Unless I understood that, he said, I would never understand anything about Onassis at all. Although he had become engrossed in his new role as Greek ambassador at large to the Arab world, he had read each draft of my book and checked the galleys, with a lawyer's attention to detail. The first edition I took to Athens was a token of my gratitude. I believed I had written the last word on the subject of Aristotle Socrates Onassis. I was disappointed when a few days later Georgakis told me that although I had gotten closer than any writer ever would to the truth about Onassis, I had also missed the real story. It was not what I expected or wanted to hear. I should have looked more closely at the events surrounding Onassis's marriage to Jackie Kennedy, he said. He liked to tease me with ambiguity, but I was in no mood for games. Having arranged the wedding on Scorpios, he was uniquely qualified to know the truth. Why didn't he just tell me what I'd missed? "I can't. It would destroy Christina," he answered, defensively. "Let sleeping dogs lie." I knew that his position as permanent secretary of the International Committee of the Alexander Onassis Foundation put him in a delicate situation. I tried to refine my questions, to draw him out without embarrassing him, but he was too smart a lawyer not to see through that. In the following months, as information trickled in from unexpected sources, as it always does after publication of any biography, hints of a more complex story began to emerge. "A point is the beginning of all geometry. A percentage point is the beginning of all fortunes. Before that point, nothing matters," Onassis had told Christina when she asked about his fortune-making years. I knew that she had never read Ari. "I'm afraid of what I might discover," she told me, although in truth, she had never shown much curiosity about her family's past. In May 1988, I had lunch with her in Paris and gave her a videotape of The Richest Man in the World, a Hollywood miniseries of my biography. I hadn't seen her as often as when her father was alive, and at 37, she had changed in ways I still find difficult to define. I used to think that being rich was some kind of nirvana. It isn't. I've discovered that since my father died, she told me. I asked whether that had made her harder or more vulnerable. Wiser, she answered. I heard nothing from her for 5 months. At the beginning of October, she called me in London. She was shortly going to Buenos Aires to celebrate a friend's 40th birthday and suggested that we have lunch in Paris before she left. She had finally read Ari and wanted to discuss it with me, she said. We lunched at a cafe on Rue Capucine, behind the place Vendôme. She had shed about 40 pounds in a Swiss clinic since our last meeting, but was still heavier than in 1970 when I had first taken her out in London. Even after 4 failed marriages and numerous unhappy love affairs, her face was still gentler than it looked in press photographs. She had just returned from Geneva, where she had written her last will and testament for the 8th time since her father died. Writing her will always gave her pleasure. If you want to find out how you really feel about somebody, write your will. It concentrates the mind wonderfully, she told me mischievously. She talked about the men who were not remembered in the will, men who had let her down and used her. No wonder my head is so messed up, she said, although I knew that her heavy prescription drug habit didn't help her state of mind much either. She took risks her Parisian friend and confidant, Florence Grinda, begged her not to take. After her first suicide attempt in 1974, and ever since her uncle, Dr. Theodore Garofalidis, had prescribed the antidepressant drug imipramine, she had been on an upward curve of amphetamine addiction. Unable to use a needle on herself, she had hired a permanent private nurse to administer the shots. Christina talked about Thierry Roussel, her last husband, and the father of her daughter, Athena, who was a few months short of her 4th birthday. She knew that Roussel, whom she still loved, was not liked by her friends and was distrusted by her advisers, who were appalled at the way he had two-timed her with his Swedish mistress. Thierry is a Frenchman, she shrugged, as if that explained everything. I suspected that she was not telling me these things without a purpose, but was it to prove that she trusted me, or to appear unguarded about one thing in order to dupe me about something else? The only thing I could be sure of was that she was her father's daughter. Despite the plastic surgery on her nose and jawline, she still had his looks about the eyes and mouth, and quite a bit of his charm and wiles, too. I was still trying to figure out her motives when she told me that she liked my biography of her father. I'd gotten him almost right most of the time, although I had failed to understand his capacity to hate. When he hated, nobody was spared. It destroyed us all in the end, she said. It was an extraordinary statement, and I was still wondering how to respond to it when she added, "But he was not a bad man. He did some bad things, he made some bad mistakes, but he was never deliberately wicked." Onassis had been dead 13 years, but talking about him touched her to the point of tears. Although I knew that her relationship with her father defied her comprehension, I was moved by her loyalty and her determination to defend his name. Although she was having difficulty explaining exactly what troubled her, I gathered that she wanted me to write a magazine piece about Onassis's marriage to Jackie Kennedy that would clarify some issues I hadn't dealt with in my book. Georgakis had told me I had missed the real story, and I wondered whether this was the same lacuna that was troubling Christina. I'd planned to fly back to London that evening, but having seen her in any number of emotional states in the past, I knew that she would not be able to continue our conversation coherently that night, and I decided to stay over. The following day we met at a café on the Quai des Grands Augustins. Her energies revived by a good night's sleep, she seemed much stronger and more purposeful. Having made me swear to keep her confidence and not to use the story without her agreement, she told me, like a lawyer summarizing the evidence for the defense, what was causing her so much consternation. In 1968, she told me, Onassis had paid a Palestinian terrorist named Mahmoud Hamshari, who later became a leading figure in Black September, the terror group responsible for the massacre of 11 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics, protection money for his airline, Olympic Airways. Later, Onassis learned that his money had been used to finance the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Even from this brief outline, her concern was understandable. For Bobby Kennedy's death had cleared the way for Onassis to marry his brother, John F. Kennedy's widow. A marriage that Bobby had sworn would happen only over his dead body. Since nothing was allowed to be accidental around the Kennedys, theories grew around the family like Boston ivy. Christina feared that if the link were discovered, if somebody followed the money, who would believe that her father had not been directly responsible for setting up the murder? I had known Christina for 20 years, and although I felt that there was something she was not telling me, I knew this was not the time to press her. We agreed to meet again, together with Georgakis, at the beginning of December. "Perhaps you could come over for my birthday," she suggested. She would be 38 on December 11th, and had arranged a party at Maxime's. I wouldn't miss it for anything, I told her. 3 weeks later, she was found dead in her bath in Buenos Aires, the city where her father had made his first fortune 60 years before. Georgakis refused to discuss the matter with me after Christina's death, but when I told him that I had been asked to write her biography, he told me, "Do it if you want to, but she's a sideshow. Her father's still the story." It was more than 3 years before he finally agreed to help me unravel the secret that was at the heart of Onassis's marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, and the truth about the murder of Bobby Kennedy. "It isn't quite as straightforward as Christina thought it was," he began, with a sense of understatement that I now realize perfectly defined the man. "I must," he said, "begin with the premise that, for Onassis, Bobby Kennedy was unfinished business from way back." 1. The Blood Trade. Were one to ask me in which direction I think man's strongest, I should say his capacity to hate. H.W. Beecher, 1813 to 1884. Robert Kennedy and Aristotle Onassis met for the first time at a cocktail party given by the English socialite Pamela Churchill at the Plaza Hotel in New York City in the spring of 1953, the year Jacqueline Lee Bouvier married John F. Kennedy. Pamela Churchill was a shrewd networker long before the term had been invented, and her guest list had been drawn from the elite of the American establishment and the world's richest people. Daughter of an English baron, and the former wife of Randolph Churchill, the drunkard son of the British Prime Minister, Pamela, who would become the model for the elegant tramp lady Ina Coolberth in Truman Capote's Answered Prayers, knew the great and near great of 5 continents. It was said that for legendary amounts of money, she had slept with many of them. She had known Bobby since 1938, when his father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was the American ambassador to England. She and Bobby's older sister Kathleen were debutantes together in the last London season before the start of World War II, and had remained friends until Kathleen's death in a plane crash in 1948. Onassis was not such an old friend. Since Pamela's ex-husband Randolph had introduced them in the south of France several months earlier, however, an introduction that Onassis said had cost him £2,000, some £40,000 in today's currency, the Greek shipping millionaire had become a close one. Her lover, he said. Not so, she protested, although her veracity in such matters was as questionable as Onassis's. Onassis was far too earthy for her tastes, Pamela told friends. An unmistakable arriviste, he possessed a volatile temper, especially when he'd had too much to drink, and his habit of smashing plates and making scenes in restaurants offended her English sensibilities. Although Onassis was attracted to Pamela's world and knew he would be accepted more easily if he adopted the elegant dress, language, and manners of their class, much as his brother-in-law, Stavros Niarchos, had done, he refused. "I won't play the hypocrite for anyone," he told his young, English-educated wife Tina, daughter of the 1930s shipping king Stavros Livanos, when she tried to break him out of his Greek chrysalis and repackage him as an English toff. Nevertheless, Pamela Churchill was a practical woman, and it was clear that her interest in Onassis had been rekindled and her sense of tolerance restored by the news that he had just bought the Principality of Monaco. More precisely, hiding behind a maze of Panamanian fronts, he had acquired SBM, a moribund property company that owned an Edwardian pile of real estate in Monte Carlo, including the casino, the yacht club, the Hotel de Paris, and about one-third of the Principality's 375 acres. Situated between the oil fields of the Middle East and the markets of Europe and North America, Monte Carlo was a perfect base for Onassis's operations. The climate pleased him, the social life met with Tina's approval, and the Principality was tax-free. Overnight, Onassis had become famous. Suddenly everything he did was news. His wealth, as well as the hints of something undisclosed about his past, made wonderful copy. More than just another rich Greek, this small, dark, sybaritic figure with sensual, heavy-lidded eyes was recognized in the street. Women began to proposition him as if he were a movie star. He took to wearing dark glasses and engaged a public relations man. Reporters dubbed him the King of Monaco, a tabloid ennoblement that did not go down well with Rainier, the Princess of Monaco. He gave interviews on how to handle women. "I approach every woman as a potential mistress," he said. "Beautiful women cannot bear moderation. They need an inexhaustible supply of excess." But his love affair with the media was not entirely motivated by ego. His cultivated image as a mysterious but magnanimous rags-to-riches tycoon also sanctioned his sharp deals, in the words of one American aide. And no deal had been sharper than his acquisition, 5 years earlier, of 10 U.S. surplus T2 tankers. Because of their size and strategic significance, the ships had been forbidden to foreigners, but at $1.5 million each, they had been an irresistible purchase for Onassis, and with the help of a U.S. corporation fronted by 3 American citizens, he easily circumvented the exclusion clause and bought them. Robert Kennedy also became front-page news for the first time in 1953, and if the 1950s were not to be his glory years, as they were for Onassis, they were unquestionably heady ones. Small and more Irish and intense than his brothers, with a psychology coiled tightly as a spring, after graduating from the University of Virginia Law School in 1951, Kennedy took a job in the criminal division of the Department of Justice. Assigned to menial legwork on tax fraud cases in a district office in Brooklyn, he quit after only a few months to work on his older brother Jack's senatorial campaign. After Jack was elected in 1952, though, 27-year-old Bobby felt stranded, a lawyer with no courtroom experience and no certain way to turn. His father suggested that he join Senator Joseph McCarthy's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, an offshoot of a low-profile committee on government operations, which McCarthy had turned into a power base for his notorious communist witch hunt. Although not yet his own ism, McCarthy was already notorious and dangerous. No politician of the age, said the writer Richard Rovere, had surer, swifter access to the dark places of the American mind. Although he had never been able to prove his charge that 205 communists had infiltrated the State Department, McCarthy continued to use innuendo and allegations of communist conspiracies to destroy America, to exploit the fears and frustrations of a nation weary of the war in Korea and worried by communist advances in Eastern Europe and China. Although John Kennedy strongly advised against it, Bobby decided it would be exciting to expose corruption and uncover communist plots. He told his father to go ahead and talk to McCarthy about giving him a job. Joe Kennedy had been a financial backer of McCarthy for some time, although how much he poured into the Republican senator's coffers is still not known. Nevertheless, the amount was apparently sufficient to stop McCarthy from going to Massachusetts to stump for John Kennedy's Republican opponent when the future president was running for the Senate in the Eisenhower landslide year of 1952, a move many believe ensured Kennedy's victory. Joe Kennedy may thus have felt he had McCarthy in his pocket when he asked him to appoint Bobby chief counsel on his permanent subcommittee on investigations. But McCarthy said he had already promised the job to Roy Cohn, a young assistant U.S. attorney in New York with his own well-established reputation for anti-communist zeal. He had helped to convict Julius and Ethel Rosenberg as atomic spies. All McCarthy could offer Bobby was a job as Cohn's assistant counsel. It was more than a passing disappointment to Bobby, irritated at being passed over in favor of Cohn, who was 18 months younger than Bobby. The young lawyer began showing signs of a bitter competitive streak that Onassis would ruthlessly exploit in years to come. Bobby felt he was getting nowhere, an old family friend said, recalling Kennedy's frustration at having to settle for the role of Cohn's assistant counsel. He was angry and got mad at people all the time. A lot of people thought he was an asshole. His new brother-in-law, George Skakel, considered him a chicken shit little bastard, and couldn't see what his sister Ethel saw in the little prick. Rather more elegantly, Jackie Kennedy would later tell Onassis that Bobby had a gift for estrangement. But even friends who were used to seeing Bobby take his frustrations out on others were puzzled by his angry reaction to Onassis's presence at Pamela Churchill's soiree on that spring evening in 1953. Their contempt for each other was palpable. A definite sense of physical challenge was in the air, said British diplomat Sir John Russell. Bobby Kennedy and Ari Onassis, men who could bully as well as charm. Short, rumpled-looking men whose clothes always appeared to be off the rack, no matter how much they'd cost. I never saw either one of them in a suit that was pressed or shoes that weren't scuffed, said one mutual acquaintance. They must have looked strangely out of place among Churchill's elegant guests at the Plaza Hotel that spring evening. Bobby was 27 years old. Onassis was 53, but pretending to be 6 years younger. Sir John thought it very odd that two men born a quarter of a century and a world apart should vie with each other like a couple of Kilkenny cats. When Sir John Russell called Churchill the following day, she was clearly aroused by the clash of egos. My, those two fellows bared their tribal qualities last night, didn't they, though? She had never seen Bobby's eyes icier, or bluer, she said. They were just like his father's, after Joe had done something truly unconscionable. Sir John, a man deeply versed in the more scandalous gossip of London society, knew that Pamela's familiarity with the color and chill of Joe Kennedy's eyes when he had behaved badly was more than mere guesswork. Later, in Truman Capote's roman à clef, Lady Ina Coolberth would describe how, when she was Kathleen Kennedy's weekend houseguest at age 18, she had been raped by Kathleen's father when he slipped into her bed in the small hours. The real offense, however, was not Joe's ravishment of her, but his failure to leave her some tangible proof of his gratitude. At breakfast, complained Pamela's acquisitive alter ego in the novel. There was never a wink or a nod, just the good old daddy of my schoolgirl chum. It was uncanny and rather cruel. After all, he'd had me, and I'd even pretended to enjoy it. There should have been some sentimental acknowledgement, a bauble, a cigarette box. The story was a familiar one to anyone who knew Churchill well. Capote, who was counted among her closest friends, assured Joe Fox, our mutual editor at Random House, that Ina Coolberth was not based on Pamela Churchill. She is Pamela Churchill. Is it possible, therefore, that Bobby Kennedy simply lost his cool because he suspected that Onassis, a man who made a point of discovering the indiscretions as well as the weaknesses of his friends, knew about his father's infamous conduct And who knows what other Kennedy secrets Pamela might have let slip? Certainly, despite all his brashness, Kennedy was easily unsettled. But is it a sufficient explanation for their...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?